The bell rang at 4:30 in the morning and the cook had been up since 3. The fire was already going. The coffee was already on. The sourdough biscuits were already in the Dutch oven, buried in coals rising in the dark. By the time the Cowboys rolled out of their blankets, the cook had been working for 90 minutes. This was the ranch cook's arithmetic. 3 meals a day, 6 days a week, for 15 to 20 men who would spend the next 12 hours on horseback, in weather, moving cattle across country that did not care whether they ate or not. Charles Goodnight invented the chuckwagon in 1866 by converting a surplus Army Studebaker wagon. Cookie, as the cook was universally called, earned between $25 and $45 a month in the 1870s and 1880s, more than any cowboy, because no outfit ran without him. The XIT Ranch in Texas logged its 1892 provisions at 1,750 pounds of flour and 400 pounds of beans for 10 men over 13 weeks. These are 15 forgotten ranch cook meals that fueled America's cowboys. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Number 15. Sourdough biscuits. The starter cookie kept alive like a patient. The sourdough starter that a good ranch cook carried in a sealed keg on the chuckwagon was not a recipe. It was a living culture, fed daily, kept warm in cold weather and cool in hot weather, transported across the open range without refrigeration, and considered so important to the outfit's function that a cook who lost his starter had lost his job. Flour cost approximately 3 to 5 cents a pound in the 1880s. The biscuit produced cost almost nothing. The process: a scoop of starter mixed with flour, salt, and a small amount of lard worked quickly on the tailgate, cut into rounds, arranged in the Dutch oven, the lid sealed, buried in coals with more coals ped on the lid. 12 to 15 minutes. The biscuit came out pale gold on the top, dark and slightly crisp on the bottom, soft and warm and slightly sour inside, with the yeasty tang of a starter that had been alive for 3 years. Nothing else on this list was possible without the starter. Cookie fed the starter before he fed the men, before he built the fire, before he started the coffee, before he woke the first cowboy, because the starter that died overnight was a starter that did not produce biscuits for breakfast, and a breakfast without biscuits on the open range in 1882 was not a breakfast. Number 14. Pinto beans. The staple that was never optional. The XIT Ranch's 1892 provision log recorded 400 pounds of dried pinto beans for 10 men over 13 weeks. The arithmetic of the pinto bean on the open range: dried beans at approximately 4 cents a pound in 1892 were the cheapest protein available, the most calorie-dense food that survived indefinitely without refrigeration, and the one item on the chuckwagon that was never exhausted. The preparation: a pound of dried pintos soaked overnight in the water barrel, simmered all morning in the Dutch oven with a piece of salt pork and an onion and a handful of chili peppers if the outfit was in Texas or New Mexico, the beans softening over 4 to 6 hours into a thick and savory and slightly smoky pot that smelled of pork fat and dried chili and of the morning's fire. The beans were dark and dense and slightly mealy inside, the broth thick and rich from the rendered salt pork. Cowboys called them whistleberries. They ate them at every meal regardless. The whistleberries were always there, which meant that no cowboy on any outfit from Texas to Montana ever went to bed without a bowl of pinto beans in his recent memory, and that the cook who ran out of beans was a cook who had failed the most fundamental obligation of the chuckwagon. Number 13. Son of a bitch stew, the meal when a steer went down. On a cattle drive in the 1870s and 1880s, the value of a single steer at the railhead in Abilene or Dodge City was approximately $40, and every head of cattle that arrived at the railhead was profit. Cowboys did not eat their employer's inventory, but when a steer went lame from a stone bruise or a broken leg, or when a stray from another outfit wandered into the herd, Cookie got to work. Son of a bitch stew, called son of a gun stew around women and children, was made from the parts of the butchered animal that could not be dried or preserved: liver, kidneys, heart, marrow gut, sweetbreads, all cut into pieces and cooked together in the Dutch oven with water, salt, wild onions, and whatever else Cookie had available. The stew was dark and slightly gamey and intensely savory, the liver breaking down and thickening the liquid, the kidneys remaining firm and mineral, the sweetbreads soft and rich. The cowboys who ate it in 1878 on the Chisholm Trail were not eating it for the experience. They were eating beef after weeks without it. and the organ meats that went into the stew were the first fresh protein many of them had seen since the last steer went down 3 weeks earlier. Number 12. Salt pork and red-eye gravy. The daily protein. Salt pork, cured and brined fat and muscle from a hog's belly, packed in barrels of salt, shelf-stable for months, appeared on the chuckwagon as the primary daily protein source when no steer had been butchered and no game had been shot. It cost approximately 8 cents a pound in the 1880s. Cookie cut thick slices from the barrel, fried them in the cast-iron skillet over the morning fire until the fat rendered and the exterior turned golden and slightly crisp. The red-eye gravy came from what remained in the skillet, a pour of strong black Arbuckle's coffee into the hot salt pork drippings, combining at high heat into a thin, dark, intensely savory liquid, barely thickened, slightly bitter from the coffee, salty from the drippings. Dense and slightly chewy, the fat rendered to a golden caramelized edge, the salt present in every bite because the brine had penetrated through the entire cut. Poured over sourdough biscuits. Breakfast on the open range in 1880. Not optional. The open range did not offer alternatives. Number 11. Arbuckle's Coffee, the brand that replaced the concept of coffee. In 1865, John and Charles Arbuckle of Pittsburgh patented a process for roasting coffee beans and coating them in a mixture of egg whites and sugar to seal in the roasted flavor, and selling them in 1-pound pre-roasted bags under the name Ariosa that Cowboys called Arbuckles. The price ranged from 15 to 25 cents a pound in the 1870s and 1880s. Before Arbuckles, Camp Coffee demanded that the cook roast green beans in a skillet over the fire and grind them by hand. After Arbuckles, Cookie tore open a pre-roasted bag, boiled the grounds in the Camp Coffee pot, and served a coffee that was strong and dark and slightly bitter and hot enough to matter at 4:30 in the morning in Wyoming in October. Arbuckles became so dominant on the open range that most cowboys of the 1870s and 1880s were unaware there was any other brand. Each bag contained a stick of peppermint candy. The cowboy who volunteered to operate the hand grinder got the candy, which meant that on any outfit with Arbuckle's Coffee, the grinding was done immediately and enthusiastically and without being asked twice. The grinder was never idle on any outfit that carried Arbuckle's Coffee, because the stick of peppermint candy in each 1-pound bag was the most effective incentive system in the cattle industry. The candy did the management. Number 10. Spotted Pup, the dessert cookie made in a good mood. Spotted Pup was the chuckwagon and ranch cook name for rice pudding made with raisins. Rice at approximately 5 cents a pound in the 1880s. Raisins at approximately 10 cents a pound, cooked together in the Dutch oven with water and sugar, and sometimes canned evaporated milk if the outfit was far enough into the 1890s to have access to canned goods. Cookie made Spotted Pup on nights when the drive had gone well and the weather was not threatening. It was a reward without being called a reward. The pudding. Rice simmered until soft, the raisins stirred in near the end, sugar and evaporated milk finishing it, the Dutch oven placed back on the coals until the mixture was thick and slightly sticky, the raisins swollen and sweet throughout the pale, starchy rice. Spotted Pup arrived without announcement. It meant the drive had gone well, cattle quiet, no losses, and the cook had noticed, and this was his way of acknowledging it without saying anything that would sound like praise. The cook's authority on a cattle drive or working ranch was second only to the trail boss, and in the daily operations of feeding and camp management, it exceeded even that. No one argued with Cookie about the food. No one complained about the coffee to Cookie's face. No one questioned the schedule of meals or the quantity of portions. The rules of the chuckwagon were enforced not by the trail boss but by the cook, and the cowboys understood them. Do not approach the chuckwagon from the upwind side. Do not take the last of anything if you are unsure you are the last man. Do not leave food on your plate, and if you arrive late to a meal, you do not eat. The cook earned more than the cowboys because the cook was not a cowboy. The cook was the operation. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We have more of this. List number 9. Pot roast in the Dutch oven. The Sunday meat. On working ranches of the 1920s and 1930s, when the bunkhouse cook had access to a wood-burning stove and regular supply deliveries, the Sunday pot roast became the weekly occasion meal. A chuck roast from the ranch's own beef at approximately 15 to 25 cents a pound in the 1930s. browned in hot lard until the exterior was deeply browned and slightly caramelized, then transferred to the Dutch oven with water and onions and potatoes and whatever root vegetables the bunkhouse cellar contained. The lid sealed, the pot placed in the oven for 3 to 4 hours until the beef had softened into a yielding and falling apart tenderness. The braising liquid reduced to a thick and dark and savory gravy. The potatoes absorbed the beef fat and the onion sweetness. The beef itself, slightly dark at the exterior from the initial browning, pale and tender inside, the connective tissue dissolved into the surrounding liquid. Sunday dinner on the working ranch was the meal that separated the week from itself. The pot roast marked Sunday. The week ended at the Sunday pot roast and another one began after it, and every cowboy at the bunkhouse table in 1932 understood this without it being explained. Number 8. Fried beefsteak, the occasion in a skillet. The fried beefsteak that appeared on the chuckwagon or bunkhouse table when a steer had been butchered, a round steak or a sirloin cut to roughly 3/4 of an inch thickness, dropped into a cast iron skillet with a 1/4 inch of hot lard, was not the same dish as the chuck roast braised for 3 hours on Sunday. It was immediate. It needed the fire hot and the lard to be smoking, and the cook's attention to be absolute for the 4 to 5 minutes between raw and correct. The exterior came out dark and slightly caramelized where the meat had contacted the hot cast iron, the interior remaining pale and slightly pink and yielding and warm, the beef fat rendering during the cooking and basting the steak from underneath. A working cowboy in the 1880s earning $30 a month ate fresh beef perhaps twice a month when a steer was butchered. He ate everything else the rest of the time. The fried steak was not taken for granted. It arrived infrequently, perhaps twice a month when the drive went well and a steer was butchered, and it was consumed in complete silence, which was the only review a meal on the open range ever received and the most honest one available. Number 7. Dried apple pie, boggy top in the Dutch oven. Cowboys called it boggy top, the dried apple pie that Cookie produced in the Dutch oven from dried apple slices at approximately 8 cents a pound in the 1880s, rehydrated in water overnight until they had swelled to something resembling, but not identical to, a fresh apple. The filling, the rehydrated apples combined with sugar and cinnamon and a small amount of flour to thicken the liquid that the cooking produced, poured into a lard pastry shell that Cookie made on the tailgate of the chuckwagon, the top crust laid over, the Dutch oven sealed and buried in coals. The pie came out imprecise in shape. The Dutch oven was round and the crust fitted the oven rather than a pie plate, with a top crust that was slightly pale where it had not contacted the lid and golden where it had. The filling, warm and slightly thick, the dried apple having cooked into a jammy and slightly sweet and slightly tart mass that tasted of the cinnamon and of the apple's concentrated sugar and of the lard in the pastry. Boggy top was not the pie a man's wife made at home. The open range had no wives and no pie plates. Boggy top was what the Dutch oven could produce. The Dutch oven was never wrong. Number 6. Peach cobbler, the dessert for a good drive. Canned peaches reached the chuckwagon in the late 1880s and early 1890s as canned goods became available along the western supply routes at prices of approximately 15 to 20 cents a can. And Cookie, who had been making peach cobbler from dried fruit for a decade, discovered that the canned version produced something different, a brighter filling, more liquid, with the peach flavor more present and the texture more yielding. The cobbler, canned peaches poured directly into the Dutch oven with their liquid, sugar added, a biscuit dough dropped by spoonfuls over the top, coals heaped above and below, 20 to 25 minutes. The topping came out golden and slightly risen, the biscuit dough having absorbed the peach liquid from below. The filling was sweet and slightly caramelized at the edges where the peach liquid had reduced against the hot cast iron. The cowboys who ate peach cobbler on a drive in Wyoming in 1893 were eating the most expensive item on the chuckwagon's menu. Cookie made it when the trail boss said so. The trail boss said so when the drive was ahead of schedule. Peach cobbler meant they were winning. Number 5. Bear sign, the donuts that kept men from quitting. Bear sign was the cowboy term for donuts. Fried sweet dough rings produced in a skillet of hot lard at temperatures Cookie managed by feel rather than by thermometer, and the chuckwagon cook who could produce bear sign was not an ordinary cook. He was a negotiating advantage. Andy Adams documented an outfit in the 1870s that kept a cook on through the spring specifically because he could make bear sign, sweet enough and brown to a turn. The dough, flour at 3 cents a pound in 1880, sugar, eggs, lard, a small amount of the sourdough starter or baking powder, mixed into a soft dough, rolled out, cut into rings, dropped into lard heated in the cast iron skillet to approximately 375 degrees by Cookie's assessment. The donut, golden on the exterior, soft inside, slightly sweet, with the specific richness of a fried dough that has been cooked in animal fat rather than vegetable oil. Men who threatened to leave an outfit stayed for bear sign. The history of the Western cattle drive is partly a history of fried dough. Bear sign held the outfit together. Number 4. Pan de Campo. The Tex-Mex bread cookie learned from the vaqueros. Pan de Campo, camp bread, was a flat, unleavened or slightly leavened round bread cooked directly on the cast iron skillet over an open fire, and it arrived on Texas and New Mexico chuck wagons through the influence of the vaqueros, the Mexican and Mexican-American cowboys who worked the Texas range from the early 1800s onward and whose cooking traditions informed the chuckwagon menu more thoroughly than any other single source. Flour at 4 cents a pound in the 1880s. Salt, lard, water. The dough, flour and salt and lard combined until the mixture resembled coarse sand. Water added until the dough just held together, pressed into a round about an inch thick, placed in the dry, cast iron skillet over moderate coals. The bread cooked for approximately 10 to 12 minutes per side, developing a slightly dark and dry exterior and a soft and warm interior that smelled of the rendered lard and of the fire's smoke. Pan de Campo arrived on the plate dense and slightly flat and slightly charred at the edges, and completely capable of absorbing the red-eye gravy or the pinto bean liquid that accompanied it. It required no starter, no Dutch oven, no waiting. The skillet was always hot. The bread was always ready. Number 3. Cornbread. The bread that required no yeast and no patience. Cornbread on the working ranch and cattle drive required 3 things: cornmeal, lard, and a hot skillet, and it produced in 15 minutes what sourdough biscuits required overnight to achieve: a dense and slightly gritty and savory bread that absorbed gravy, carried beans, accompanied fried steak, and needed no starter and no waiting and no particular skill from the cook. Cornmeal at approximately 3 cents a pound in the 1880s. The batter, cornmeal combined with salt and a small amount of baking powder if available, otherwise without, mixed with water into a pourable batter, poured into a skillet greased with lard and placed over the fire or in the Dutch oven. The cornbread came out slightly dark and dry at the bottom where it had contacted the hot lard, pale and slightly crumbly inside, with the gritty and slightly sweet flavor of coarsely ground dried corn. In the bunkhouse rather than the chuck wagon, the ranch cook could bake cornbread in the wood stove oven and achieve a slightly more even rise and a slightly crisper top. Either version did the same work. Cornbread was the bread of the ranches that could not maintain a sourdough starter. It needed no maintenance. The cornmeal waited in its sack until the cook needed it. Number 2. The Dutch oven, the tool that made the cook possible. The Dutch oven that rode in the boot beneath the chuck wagon pantry, cast iron 3 to 6 gallons in capacity, available from Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs for approximately $1.50 to $300 in the 1880s, with a flat lid and short legs that allowed it to sit over coals, was not a cooking tool in the same category as a skillet or a spoon. It was a technology. Buried in a bed of hot coals with more coals heaped on top, the Dutch oven created an enclosed oven that maintained temperatures between 300 and 375 degrees by the simple physics of thermal mass. The cast iron absorbed the heat of the coals and held it steady for as long as the coals remained active. In a Dutch oven at 350 degrees in 1885 in Wyoming, Cookie could bake sourdough biscuits, braise a pot roast, simmer spotted pup, produce a dried apple pie, or cook a peach cobbler, without a stove, without a thermometer, and without electricity. The National Cowboy Museum records that a Dutch oven and some sourdough starter was the entirety of what a capable cook needed to feed a trail crew. The combination was sufficient. Number 1. Cookie himself, the second in command who never rode a horse. The ranch cook, Cookie, was the second most important person on any cattle drive or working ranch, outranked only by the trail boss, and outranking every cowboy in the outfit in pay, authority, and institutional importance. He earned between $25 and $45 a month in the 1870s and 1880s, when cowboys earned $25 to $30. He woke before everyone else. The fire was dark and cold when he lit it. The coffee was hot before the first man rolled out of his blanket. He drove the chuckwagon, pitched camp, maintained the sourdough starter, ordered provisions, and served as nurse, barber, dentist, and banker. He was not a cowboy who cooked. He was a cook who kept cowboys functional. Most cookies were former Civil War military cooks or former cowboys too old or too injured to ride, and they brought to the chuckwagon the discipline of institutional cooking. Everything on time, everything sufficient, nothing wasted. The XIT Ranch in 1892 provisioned 10 men for 13 weeks on 1,750 pounds of flour and 400 pounds of beans. Cookie made that arithmetic feed 15 people. The sourdough biscuits and the pinto beans and the salt pork and the spotted pup and the boggy top and the Arbuckle's coffee, all of it flowed from Cookie's skill and Cookie's schedule. The chuckwagon fed the outfit. Cookie ran the chuckwagon. The outfit ran on Cookie. Drop in the comments if you had a family member who cooked on a working ranch, because the meals that came out of a Dutch oven buried in coals at 4 in the morning on the open range in 1880 are as close to forgotten as American food gets, and they deserve to be remembered.